at this session at Angela McCoury, first of all. And as I mentioned earlier, today is her feast day. She was orphaned at the age of 15, and very shortly after she was orphaned, her younger sister died. And remember, Angela McCoury is from Italy, and the faith is very much a part of their lives there. But the devastating thing for Angela was that her sister died without the anointing, okay? Now, at that time, I should mention this because you should know this as a result of the Vatican Council. The anointing of the sick is a sacrament that is supposed to heal people. But they developed a theology in the Middle Ages that it was the anointing like a king would get, and it was to be done before you entered heaven. See, the anointing of the sick was to send you into heaven. And the reason why that happened was, I told you in the early church you could only go to confession once in your life. Well, people weren't stupid. You didn't go to confession until you were dying, okay? So people would leave it off. Well, if you leave it off, you realize you can't get any other sacrament. You can't be anointed when you're sick because you have to be in the state of grace to receive a sacrament. So you're putting confession off, so you can't be anointed. You also couldn't get communion. That's where the term viaticum developed. So if you're really lucky, you would suddenly realize you're dying. You call in the priest. The priest, here's your confession, anoints you with oil, gives you the viaticum, and if you're really lucky, you drop dead at that point, okay? If you're not lucky, you live another 40 years and can't sin, okay? So anyway, when her sister died without the anointing, she had the feeling that her sister couldn't enter heaven. So she began to have very strong prayers, and God gave her a vision. And the vision God gave her was of her sister in heaven, okay? And I'm almost sorry this is recorded, but I'll tell you a private experience that I had. My mother, I'd love to know what went on in her life, but she never had anything nice to say about people. Like, she wasn't mean to me or anything, but anytime she talked about someone, she would tell me what was wrong with them. Anyone she was talking about, whether it was her husband, my sister, my grandmother, any of them, she would, and I finally learned not to pay too much attention to it. You know, you couldn't allow that stuff. But when my mother died, I was very concerned about my mother. And probably 6 months after my mother died, I was standing in front of the church getting ready to go in, and I had a vision. It was very interesting. The top of the church was gone, and I saw these tiers of people like in football stadium, thousands going up like this. And as I was walking down the aisle, they were all facing the altar. But as I was walking down the aisle, one or another would turn to me and look at me. And when they did, they were always like it would be like the picture that you knew of St. Francis. That's kind of like what looked at you, or the picture you knew of St. Joan of Arc or something. I recognized the figures immediately because they were exactly like the holy cards and stuff I had. But one of the figures that turned and looked at me was my mother. And I believe that's what God was saying to me. She's fine, you know, she's safe. So, but anyway, so Angela had this experience, and apparently she was very beautiful, and she wanted to live a life dedicated to God. And so she used to find ways to make herself less attractive. She put ashes in her hair and stuff like that. Anyway, she finally became very concerned about the education of young girls. Now you can imagine her, she's orphaned at 15, and then her sister, who's younger than her, dies. And so she's very concerned about young girls in that world being educated. Now, if you were very, very wealthy, what you would do your daughter would enter one of the monasteries, the women's monasteries, and would be educated for a certain number of years, learn to read and write and stuff like this. But you had to be very wealthy because you had to support the monastery while the child was there and that sort of thing. That wasn't open to ordinary people. And so she wanted to see these young girls were educated. So she wanted to teach them. And she eventually opened a school in her home for young girls, largely because, as I told you, an unmarried woman could not work outside the home. So she couldn't do that, okay? And so she had to do this in her home. And she turned her home into the school, and then at a certain point, she made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And it's a very curious thing. On her pilgrimage to the Holy Land, she passed through the island of Crete. And when she passed through Crete, she went blind. Now, in the ancient world, particularly traveling, it was not unusual for people to go blind. Like if you go to the Holy Land today, you'll be surprised at the number of blind people. And one of the reasons is they have a lot of animals and everything in the streets, and they have this very dry air, and you're constantly breathing the dust of the feces of animals. And so as that gets in your eyes and get infected, you can lose your sight. And they don't have a lot of medical, the poor people there. So anyway, Angela went blind, but she continued her trip anyway, went to the Holy Land as a blind woman, went through the whole thing. And on her way home, she was miraculously cured in Crete. So she was just blind for the trip for whatever reason, and came back and went on with her teaching. She finally decided that there were a number of women who wanted to help her in the work, but they couldn't live outside their homes. So she went to Rome, and she went to the Pope for permission to found an order of women, basically as we know them, nuns, who would have a school where the girls could come to a school. And you could have grades like we have in this sort of thing, that you just wouldn't be a group of girls learning of all different ages, learning from one woman in one house, this sort of thing. And so she asked the Pope, and the Pope said no. He said that it wouldn't be safe for any of these people. And so she went back and had these 12 women who helped her, and they each had to stay in their own home. They couldn't go. So finally she went to Rome again, and this time she saw the Pope again. And she was talking to the Pope and made her petition. Again, it was no. And then she had an inspiration from God. She looked at the Pope and she said, "Who taught you to pray?" And he said, "My mother." And she said, "Who taught you the religion?" He said, "My mother." And then Angela said to him, "Do you realize if young girls aren't educated, they will get an uneducated religion? If you don't let us open schools to educate those girls, the religion that they're passing on is not going to be the strong truth. And you know very well you can't depend on the men to pass it on. It's women who pass on the faith," okay? And she won the Pope like that. He was no idiot. And that was the very first order of women called the Ursulines. And they go out and do that kind of work. The thing I'd like you to notice there, particularly, is the role of the Pope. We have a very strange idea of the what do you want to call it, the power in the church. The power in the church is the church. You know, like when Jesus said, "He who hears you hears me," Jesus wasn't speaking to the Pope. He wasn't speaking to Peter. He was speaking to the apostolic community, which was the whole church at the time. That as a church, we speak for Jesus. Jesus speaks through the church. And the main role of a person, like if you're a pope, or a bishop or a pastor or a minister in the church. The main role of a minister in the church is to discern the gifts of the community. Like, for instance, when I was pastor at Mission San Luis Obispo, one of the things we had was at the beginning of the influx of a Spanish-speaking community. And so we had the beginnings of people in the community who were monolingually Spanish. And I am monolingually English. And because I'm dyslexic, I'm lucky I'm that, okay? So it was very interesting. All the other priests would labor with these. They'd write up these sermons, and they would labor over giving them in Spanish. And the Spanish people were very polite with them and everything, but the sermons were not good. You know, if you're doing it in a language you don't know, it's not good. Your pronunciation's not good, this sort of thing. And different cultures, like if you ever go to a sermon in a church in Mexico, it's very different than the way you hear a sermon in a church in the United States. There's just different ways of functioning. And so this went on. Well, you know, all the other priests of the diocese were having all kinds of problems with it. I had in my parish a man who taught at Cal Poly, and he taught Hispanic poetry. He taught Spanish poetry. And so I called him in, and I said, I need someone to give Spanish sermons. And he says, well, I'm not a Catholic. I told him nobody's perfect. So I said, what I would ask you to do is to listen to the sermon I'm giving at one of the Masses and come back, and I can read the Spanish Mass, but I'll ask you to give the homily. And you listen to the content and then do it. And he says, well, I can translate. So I don't want you to translate because I don't think that's good. I said, listen to the idea, get the idea, and you present it. And so he did. And over a period of time, it was wonderful. We developed a huge Hispanic community, and he became a Catholic. So this whole thing worked out very, very well. And it was because I was willing to say, that's his gift. He's very good at it. Let him use it, you know, this sort of thing. And to understand, if you have a position like that in the church, you don't need to be good at everything, but you need to be able to recognize gifts. And, you know, they said a lot of times that probably one of the greatest presidents, a lot of people thought, certainly in popularity, was Jack Kennedy. But one of the things Jack Kennedy had said when he was analyzing his time in office, he said, the purpose of my job of president is to look at everything I'm supposed to be doing and find someone who does it better than me for everything. And if you do it better than me, then you'll do it. And that's basically a very Catholic position. The Catholic position is, no matter what you're doing, find someone who does it better and move it on and this sort of thing. But that's the real role. You don't have to do all these things. You have to pick people out. And you can imagine, you know, sometimes, like I love to preach. There are a lot of things you love to do. But if someone does it better than you, then you should defer to them. I oftentimes, one of the things I used to meditate on when I did this was Jesus. You may, if you think about you having made the Stations of the Cross, it'd be very interesting for me to ask you what you would think was the hardest moment in the life of Jesus. You know, you could say when he was judged by Pilate, or when he met his mother, or when they were scourging him, or when they crucified. Do you know what I think is the hardest moment in the life of Jesus? You're going to think this is funny, but I want you to know I mean it sincerely. The hardest moment in the life of Jesus was the Ascension, when he had to leave the church in that group of nincompoops, okay? But he did. The trust of Jesus in the apostles, Jesus passed his gift of teaching on to them. In the anointing of the sick, he passed his gift of healing on to them. Forgiveness, he passed it in reconciliation on to them. He passed his entire ministry into those people. And you and I are the proof it worked. It actually worked. But that's the purpose of leadership in the church, is to recognize and foster gifts in people around us. And that's what that Pope did at that point, to understand that. Incidentally, she died in 1540. I thought I'd give you a really modern one, too. This one died in 1962, and her name is Gina Molla, and another Italian lady. When I was, I told you that when I look at the saints during the year, a good percentage of them died in my lifetime. She's one of them. I try to think, what was I doing in 1962? I was in the seminary. But anyway, she was the 10th of 13 children, which at that time was not unusual in Italy. She was a very, very religious woman. She was a member of the Vincent de Paul. She was part of the Catholic Action in Italy that was rising at the time. She was married, became a pediatric doctor, a children's doctor, and had 3 children. Now, during the pregnancy of the third child, she discovered that she had cancer of the uterus. And discovering that she had cancer of the uterus, remember, she's an MD, a pediatric, so she knows exactly what this is. It isn't like you and I hearing something from our doctor. She knew exactly what was going on. And she was given 3 choices. They said, we can guarantee you live by removing your uterus, which would mean the loss of the baby. Said, we can guarantee that the child will survive if you bring the pregnancy to conclusion, but pretty well guarantee that you won't, because the cancer will have advanced that much at that point. It will have metastasized. He says the alternative is that we can go in and we can try and remove as much of the cancer as possible and not violate the life of the child, and the child will live there. And so anyway, so she had to make the choice of the 3. And now remember, she's a doctor and perfectly capable of understanding the whole thing. And the choice she made was the middle one. She says, why don't you go in, remove as much of the cancer as you can, and then we'll bring the child to term in the hopes that the child survives that, and in the hopes that I survive that. And so we'll bring the child to term. First thing I want you to know before we go on in this, all those choices are right. They're all good moral choices. If you have cancer of the uterus and your life is in danger, the removal of the baby and the uterus is not wrong. Whether you want to do it or not is yours. And the idea of not operating at all and really jeopardizing your own life is not wrong either. Those are all 3 choices anyone could make, and they're moral choices that you would make. Well, she chose the middle one. The baby survived, and she died of the metastasis of the cancer itself. And the thing that she was really canonized for was her ability to make a clear choice, in a very difficult thing. And I think one of the things to learn from her is that, it isn't, all of us, I think it's easy if we're talking, do I murder a person or do I not murder a person? That's an easy moral choice, okay? And so often we see our lives as choices between good and evil in different ways, but that's not the essence of holiness. The choice between good and evil is too easy. Those choices, the real choices are the things that don't have this horrible moral cast to them, like you're raising your child, how much can I discipline this child without completely discouraging them? And how much do I have to discipline them so they don't think they can do that? You know, that's what human life is about. Human life is about these really complex decisions, and holiness permeates those. Like, it's not a matter of sin one way or another. It's that we bring our holiness to this ability to make the difficult decisions of human life. I think of it in terms of hiking. I love hiking. And so, like, I have a friend of mine and we've been to about 8 countries. Best country to hike in, incidentally, is Japan. It's wonderful. But we've been to a lot of countries hiking. And it's interesting that you can choose 3. I'll get there faster this way, but I'm, going up a rope on a rock or something, and it'll take longer this way, but at least I'm walking like a sane person. You go through you make all these choices. They're not good and bad choices. They're real choices. And you make the choice, you take the consequences, this whole thing. But she's canonized as a person who clearly and personally, made this choice with regard to this. I'd like to give you one more. We have time. And the one more I'd like to give you is Charles Lwanga. How many of you have ever heard of him? Okay. Charles Lwanga died in 1888. Charles Lwanga had a reputation, 1886 rather. Charles Lwanga had the reputation of being the handsomest man in all of Africa. Apparently he was very good looking. We don't have any pictures or anything, but he looks really good in his holy cards, but so does everybody. So he was part of this tribe and in Uganda. And the king decided to make him one of the royal pages. And I think he was 16 or 17 years old. And so he was called to be one of the royal pages. This was very important because in the tribe itself, when you became a page to the king, you worked as a page from anywhere from the age to, like when he was called, 17, 16, you would work from that age till probably anywhere from between 20 and 25. But when you finished that, you would end up one of the leaders of the tribe. So this was the path to authority in the tribe. And it's a very powerful tribe. For Charles Lwanga was doing this. So while he was in the court of the king, he learned of the Catholic faith from 2 retainers who worked for the king there. And he learned a little bit about the Catholic faith and seemed to be kind of drawn to it. And he became a catechumen in order to become a Catholic. And at that point, he discovered that the pages for this particular king, in fact, were a male harem. And the king was sexually involved with all these young men. And no one in the tribe knew that. And of course, they're not going to talk about it, And then they get these important jobs, and they get married and go on with their lives. And so anyway, because of his contact with the Catholic faith, he began to talk to the other pages about resisting the advances of the king. And the king, as you can imagine, was not overly enthusiastic about this. So he imprisoned him with all the resisting pages, and he put them into prison. And he wanted them in prison together, but the only person he sentenced to death was Charles Lwanga. He wanted them in prison to see the nervousness of this 16, 17-year-old boy who knew he was about to be executed, to be burned at the stake. And the interesting thing is that Charles used the time there to educate the other pages in the faith. And I forget how many were originally imprisoned, but when Charles was to be burned at the stake, 21 other of the children requested to go with him, so that 22 people were burned together at the stake. And imagine, this guy isn't even baptized. He isn't even a member of the church. And he trains these people and passes on the faith as he has it, so that these people are willing to die for the faith, for the purity of the faith. And so they do. And one of the kids that night, just before he died, baptized him, one of the other kids. And so he was baptized and died. I should mention also among this, when they were canonized, the 22 Catholics, including Charles, the Pope also mentioned there were 4 others who chose to die with them too. They were not Catholics, they were Anglicans, but there were 4 other pages that were Anglicans that were there. So in the canonization, Catholic Church can't canonize an Anglican. That's up to the Anglicans to do that. But they were mentioned in the document about this thing. And I think the remarkable thing about Charles and what we should learn in our own lives is this idea of you go about what you're called to do and do it, no matter what's going on around you. Don't let what's going on around you distract you from what you're supposed to do. And I find this as one of the amazing things of Paul. You know, Paul's preaching the gospel in town. So the governor gets upset about it. He arrests Paul, throws Paul in prison. So what does Paul do? He preaches to the other prisoners and the guards and converts them. Okay? The thing is, Paul, is my job's to preach. I don't care where you put me, I'm preaching. Okay? Or my job's to win people. I don't care. Put me wherever you want. I'll win people. But the power of the gospel cannot be stopped. I don't know if you're familiar with, when Kennedy died, a memorial was written to him by Leonard Bernstein. He wrote a piece of music called The Mass. But anyway, there's a song in it that is his embodiment of his understanding the Catholic position, particularly during persecution. And some of the verses are, "Go and lock up your bold men and hold men in tow. You can silence all adventure for a century or so. Smother hope before it's risen, make it wizen like a gourd, but you cannot stop the word of the Lord. Go and lock up your bold men and hold men in tow. You can silence all adventure for a century or so, but we will not turn from the word of the Lord." And he goes through this whole thing of all these things that can go wrong, and at the end, it can't stop the gospel. And you know, history is that way. You look at, I remember when I was a young man was when Castro took over in Cuba. You know, that Castro originally was a very strong Catholic, and in the class I graduated high school from, 9 of the guys went over and fought with Castro against Bautista. Bautista was persecuting the Catholic Church, and so Castro was very, represented the Catholic position at the time. So anyway, they went over there, but in this thing that they died there. But I thought it was interesting that before Castro, before he started persecuting, Cuba was 99% Catholic with 4% church attendance. After the persecution began, Cuba was 11% Catholic with 11% mass attendance. So to me, actually, there were more Catholics after Castro than there were before. The thing is, there's something about our faith that grows under difficulty. But the key is not to forget what you're called to do. Do what you're doing, let them do whatever they want. Do what you're doing, and ultimately, the faith grows. And the final thing in the, the thing was, "You people of power, your hour is now. You plan to rule forever. You never do somehow. I stand in silent treason until reason is restored. I await the season of the word of the Lord." Which is this powerful statement. We know what's ultimately going to happen, and we wait for it to happen, and we'll do our job until it does. Okay? See if we have any questions in those. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. I just want your opinion. I've always thought the worst thing for Christ when he was on the cross and God turned away from him because all the sin.
Or he felt God was turning away from him.
Right.
Yeah.
And I always felt like that was so powerful.
Yeah, and that is embodied much in particularly Catholic theological literature. They really are very strongly see that as a moment in which he didn't feel any of the consolation of God. So that you would find much more theologians on your side than I would find on mine, no question. I don't give you credit for that, but go ahead, behind him. You had your hand up.
How are you supposed to know what to do?
I can't hear you.
How are you supposed to know what to do? You said, do what you're doing and faithful.
That do what you're doing, I think, has to do with a gradual, we talked about in the morning homily about discovering what's your gift, okay? And I think in the interaction with people, you will discover what your gift is. Is your gift just being helpful, that they somehow recognize Jesus that? Is it somehow speaking of Jesus? Is it, but you can find out what's helpful, how you uniquely carry the gospel, and then you set about doing it. And so, but I don't think that comes quickly. I think you need some time and experience to hear. But the key thing is be open to the reaction of others and see how it affects others. And then you'll find out what is your unique gift, and then set about it. Okay? Anyone else? Go ahead.
I have a question, but it was about the signs of the cross. You said that innocence is a lie, or innocence is not?
Is an unreality. There's no innocent person. People are.
Including like babies and stuff, or like?
Yeah. Why do we baptize babies? Because you're born in sin.
Okay.
Yeah. We think innocence, is not doing wrong. It isn't. Innocence really would be doing good, And most of us, by the time we do a little of both. Okay? But yeah, we baptize babies because basically they're in sin. We're born in, that's part of being a human. Okay? I don't make the rules. Okay? Anyone else?
Can you comment, I know you said this in the past about Mother Teresa.
I can't hear you. Go ahead.
Can you comment about, if you've done this in the past with Mother Teresa and gifts, and if you don't use the gifts, God gives them to those who
yeah.
use them.
Basically, one of the things that is true in the scriptures too, that the gifts of God are actually to the church. So that, for instance, if God has given you a gift of sharing the faith, that's really a gift for the church. You're the one who exercises it. And one of the teachings in the scriptures is, I think you'll know it from one of the parables, but one of the teachings of the scriptures is, if I do not use the gift that God has given me, he'll give it to somebody else because it's necessary for the church. And there are certain people who are so open to God's gifts, and I use the example in the case of Mother Teresa, that she was so open to the gifts of God that I think anyone who didn't use their gift, he threw it out her way, because she would use it, no matter what it was. That I remember an incident, I think I told you this incident, that she wanted to build a hospital in one of the places to take care of largely AIDS patients at the time. And so she wanted to build a hospital. And the bishop said, sure, you can build a hospital. And he says, I'll ask you to be very careful about raising money, because we're having difficulty in the diocese and we're trying to raise money. So we'll ask you, number one, not to raise money among Catholics in the diocese. And she says, okay. And he says, in fact, someone who would donate to you, even in not being a Catholic, are probably people who would donate to us. So we ask you not to raise money in the diocese itself. And he goes through all this list of things, and he got all finished. And she said, so if I can raise the money outside the diocese and build the hospital here and not fundraise among any of the Catholics or the non-Catholics in the diocese, I can do that. And she said, yes. She said, can I use your phone? She picked up the phone, and she phoned a non-Catholic multimillionaire in Chicago, told him how much she needed. He said, the check is in the mail. And she hung up. The thing is, she used these gifts so powerfully. If Mother Teresa asked you for something, you did it. It didn't matter who you were. You know, she had this amazing power. But it's just these gifts. If you use your gift, God will give you other gifts, because there's lots of people that don't use them. There are gifts available. Okay, anything else? Thanks very much. Appreciate your attention.